Okay, if we could begin, if everyone could take their seats, please. Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Michael Matera. I'm the director of the Americas Program here. For those of you who are here for the first time or tuning in for the first time, CSIS is a bipartisan, nonprofit, public policy center dedicated to promoting broad policy dialogue and research on foreign policy and security issues that matter most to our country and to the rest of the world. For the past 6 years, CSIS has been named the world's #1 think tank on international security issues by the University of Pennsylvania's Think Tank Index. Our Americas program covers the entire Western Hemisphere. In the first 10 months of our activity, we focused most of our programming, writing, and research on Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and the Caribbean. To underline the fundamental importance of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States, CSIS last year launched a special effort to look at Mexico. We call it the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative, and we have one of the most talented specialists on Mexico leading this initiative. Kim Breyer has studied and worked on Mexico and Latin America for more than 20 years, both in the public and private sectors. Before joining CSIS last June, Kim worked for 5 years as a vice president at a consulting firm that did country risk assessments for private clients, mostly on Mexico issues. For the past 2 years, she has participated in the George W. Bush Center's North America Competitiveness Initiative, focused on North America border infrastructure and energy policy. Previously, Kim served for more than a decade in the U.S. intelligence community as a political analyst and manager. In 2005-2006, she worked at the White House on the National Security Council staff as director for Mexico and Canada. We could have no one better qualified to lead this initiative than Kim. With that, I'd like to hand the meeting over to Kim, who, together with a group of other Mexico experts, will guide us through some of the critical border issues that have been such an intense focus of public attention in recent weeks. Before this, we're required by law to make a brief security announcement. In case of any emergency, please exit the building and by the same entrance that you came in. There'll be guidance from CSIS staff in case this happens, and there are also emergency exits at the back of the building. Thank you all very much. Kim?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, and thanks for coming, everyone, this morning. I think we have a very timely topic this morning. When we started to plan for this panel, we didn't know that we were going to be having it the Monday morning following the visit of Secretaries Kelly and Tillerson to Mexico. So we can be thankful for a little bit of dumb luck in the timing this morning, but I think it would have been timely either way. As Michael mentioned, CSIS began a new initiative last year, the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative, which we founded on the premise that the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship is one of the United States' most important and urgent relationships in the world. We believe the relationship should be governed by a clear strategic direction that values the importance of the role of our southern neighbor in working with the United States to address the full range of security and commercial priorities that we share. Today, we're here to talk about the U.S.-Mexico border, the place where nation states and our interests meet. In the past several months in the United States, we've been having a national conversation about border security. That conversation is legitimate and necessary, as providing security for the American people is the primary function of our system of government. In the modern world of transnational threats of all kinds, having a secure border is essential. I want to add, however, that a conversation about the U.S. border also touches on another major U.S. national interest, which is the commercial side. Economic security is national security, and our border plays a key role in allowing flows of legal people and legal goods in and out of the United States. The image that we currently have in our minds of the border is one of a barrier, but what we hope to do today is dive a little bit deeper into the functioning of the border and its role in meeting the dual responsibilities of at the same time being secure and impermeable by threats, while being open enough to allow the 1 billion in legal goods and people that pass through the U.S.-Mexico border every day of the year. We wanted to have a conversation today about two national interests, both security and commerce. To do that, I want to introduce another visual, another framework for thinking about the border. The border needs to be both a barrier and a conduit at the very same time. The image I think may work better for framing the debate is thinking about the border as a valve. Sometimes the valve needs to be firmly closed to prevent threats from entering or exiting. At other times, the valve needs to be open to allow for flows in two directions. It's actually a pretty sophisticated valve. Both of its functions, to be open and closed, are legitimately related to U.S. national interests. To help us think this all through, we have two panels this morning featuring experts on various aspects of border functions from both a security and commercial perspective. We've invited speakers to give us a little bit of ground truth. Our panels include speakers from both the US and Mexican governments, American and Mexican experts, and people who are joining us from the states in which they live and work, Texas and California, key border states. I want to introduce our first panel, which will be led off by Pamela Starr. Pamela, I'm thrilled to say, is a CSIS non-resident senior associate and traveled here today from California, where she's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Southern California. Pamela is one of the United States' leading experts on Mexico and the US-Mexico relationship, and her full bio is in the packet, which should have been available to you on your way in. She will be joined by representatives of both the United States and Mexican governments. I want to first welcome Jose Martin Garcia here. Jose Martin, if you don't know him, is currently the representative of the Ministry of Finance at the Embassy of Mexico. You have his full bio in your packet, but one thing I cannot go without pointing out is that Jose Martin has been working in the Mexican Embassy since 1992. And I think it is more than fair to say that he is the institutional memory at this point of both governments, the United States and Mexico, on border issues. We're also very happy to welcome Mike Houston, who is joining us from the Department of Homeland Security. He is the director for the Americas and coordinates their DHS engagement with other countries in the hemisphere, including Mexico, as well as overseeing policy development on border security issues. Thank you very much for coming.
So good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for arranging this cold weather for me, because I was going through an entire winter where it was colder in LA than here. So it was nice to actually discover you still get cold weather here. The border is where the rubber hits the road in the U.S.-Mexico relationship when we're talking about issues of trade, security, immigration, the core issues in the bilateral relationship. So given that, my task today is to sort of provide a quick overview of bilateral relations today. I like to refer to the bilateral relationship today as being at a peculiar moment, neither good nor bad, but just something unusual that we haven't seen before. Prior to the rise of candidate Donald Trump, the relationship was uniformly lauded by practitioners and analysts alike as being the best it had ever been. It's characterized by close collaboration, mutual respect, and partnership across the broad spectrum of issues in the bilateral relationship, including security matters, a historically sensitive issue for Mexico. With Trump, first as candidate and now as president, referring to Mexican immigrants as rapists and murderers, and to Mexico as a place full of bad hombres, his threatening to deport tens of thousands of undocumented Mexican migrants, his promising to build a wall between the two countries, or rather to extend the current security barrier between the two countries, and insisting then that Mexico pay for it, and then threatening to pull the United States out of the North American Free Trade Agreement. We can now say that the bilateral relationship is now more tense than it has been in at least a generation, potentially in nearly a century. This combination of deep institutionalized cooperation that still exists between the two countries, with tension emanating from the top of the U.S. government, is something we've never seen before in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Precisely where we go from here is somewhat unclear, but what is clear to me is that the relationship is unlikely to return to a pre-Trumpian status quo anytime soon, and indeed, it's unlikely to look like anything we've seen previously for quite some time. Simply put, this is because Mexico no longer trusts the United States. It doesn't trust the United States to be a reliable partner and a reliable neighbor. It's been stunned by how quickly a generation of effort to transform the image of Mexico and the United States from a problem to a partner has been reversed. It's shocked to discover that the United States is once again willing to exploit the power differential in our bilateral relationship to blatantly attempt to coerce Mexico into doing our bidding. And it has been slammed economically by Trump's anti-NAFTA rhetoric, which has played into pre-existing economic weaknesses in Mexico to generate a collapse of the peso, to undermine direct investment, to undermine consumer confidence, and as a result generate anemic growth and job creation. The shock at being disrespected and treated once again as an underling has revived in Mexico a latent but powerful strain of nationalism. While this new Mexican nationalism is not as anti-American as in the past, it is profoundly felt, it is profoundly anti-Trump, and it's unlikely to wane anytime soon. Mexicans have been reminded that the United States is at once its greatest potential ally and its greatest potential adversary. As an aside, people constantly ask me if the Mexican reaction to the politics and rhetorics of the Trump administration might lead to the victory of the nationalist candidate in Mexico, referring to the left-leaning candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And my answer is, I have no idea if López Obrador is going to win. He's well-positioned. It's unclear that he'll win. But what is clear to me, that whoever is the next president of Mexico will be a nationalist, whether he or she, whoever she is elected. And it's simply because that's the sentiment of the electorate. And so politicians are playing into that. Into this mix of U.S. coercion and Mexican nationalist response, we have to add the profound weakness of President Enrique Peña Nieto. With popular approval at just 12%, he's the most unpopular Mexican president since we have measured such things. This reflects corruption in his administration and in the administrations of governors that are close allies to him. It reflects rising crime rates and persistent impunity, and it reflects an anemic economy that, despite promises, has not found high gear, and is punctuated last month by a 20% increase in gasoline prices, which has revived a fear of inflation amongst Mexican consumers. In this context, not responding to President Trump's aggressions, or being seen as giving in to American demands, or as not protecting the interests of Mexicans living in the United States would be political suicide. So what does this bilateral relationship mean for, what does this broad context mean for the core issues in the bilateral relationship and thus the border? Let me take the issues one at a time. And I think that would be the best way to approach it. Let me start with security. This is the area of the bilateral relationship that I think is least likely to suffer from the current tension in the relationship, or rather, let me say, the last that's apt to feel the impact of this. This is because Mexico understands that the drug trade is as big a problem for Mexico as it is for the United States. Violence associated with organized crime presents a huge security challenge for Mexico. So Mexico is not eager to end bilateral security cooperation. If that ends, it's going to be more likely to come from the U.S. side. And if the United States threatens to cut it off, Mexico, for nationalist reasons, will say, okay then. Mexico also understands the importance of cooperating with the United States on counterterrorism. It knows that an attack on the United States emanating from Mexico would be a disaster for Mexican national interests. And it understands that its geographic position makes Mexico an essential security ally for the United States, and its weak power position means that Mexico doesn't have a lot of latitude to deny the United States on issues deemed essential to U.S. national security. So while a different Mexican government might approach security cooperation with the United States differently, particularly with regard to fighting organized crime, they're unlikely to threaten the United States with non-cooperation in this area. Let me turn second to immigration. I realize immigration is not a topic of today's event, but to ignore it would mean that it would be really impossible to talk about security and commerce. This is true for at least 4 reasons. First, Mexico is insisting that any renegotiation of its trade agreement with the United States includes security and immigration. Second, this is the issue that currently dominates the bilateral relationship. This is where policy is being made. Trade policy is still theoretic. We don't even have a commerce secretary in the United States, let alone a U.S. trade representative approved by the Senate. And security cooperation is still running on its institutional inertia. As such, immigration is setting the context for the security and trade cooperation between the two countries. And the Trump administration policy thus far regarding deportations of undocumented migrants and the extension of the southern wall and insisting that Mexico pay for it has made Mexico furious, poisoning the rest of the bilateral relationship. And finally, the United States is very vulnerable to Mexican pressure on this issue. Let me just elaborate on that briefly. The United States cannot return deportees without the cooperation of their home country. Mexico has been a highly cooperative partner when it comes to deporting Mexican immigrants. Mexico has also aggressively policed its southern border. On behalf of the United States, Mexico's last year returned 140,000 Central Americans who were bound for the United States. But the administration's plans for more aggressive enforcement of immigration laws and the rhetoric surrounding it has tested Mexico's patience. In particular, recent Homeland Security guidance memos laying out administration plans for aggressive enforcement of immigration law was bad enough given its content for the U.S.-Mexico elements, but it also has a provision for non-Mexican asylum seekers to be sent back to Mexico if they arrived through Mexico to wait their hearings. Mexico went ballistic. And it made it clear that they will never accept a unilateral imposition by the United States on what Mexico must do. This matters because beyond poisoning the climate for the Kellerson, put them together, the Kelly-Tillerson visit to Mexico last week, which was designed to reduce tensions in the bilateral relationship. This threatened imposition means that it has the capacity to clog up the U.S. immigration detention system, thereby complicating the deportation process. Mexico's former foreign minister and independent presidential candidate, Jorge Castañeda, has been calling for Mexico to strike back to the United States by refusing to accept any deportee unless he or she can prove that she's Mexican. The idea is that since a large number of undocumented Mexican immigrants in the United States do not have Mexican documentation, the United States would be forced to turn them back. The Mexican government has expressed zero interest in doing this. However, if the United States insists upon forcing Mexico to accept non-Mexican citizens, Mexico will be forced to check all of the papers of those being sent back across the border and will reject Mexican citizens who don't have paperwork, thereby doing exactly what Jorge wants them to do, which is to clog up the U.S. deportation system. And finally, Mexico can just stop returning Central American migrants and simply allow them to pass through Mexico on their way to the United States, thereby dramatically increasing the number of migrants crossing the southern border. So why would the Trump administration constantly and consistently act to poison such an important bilateral relationship on the area of migration? I have three potential explanations. One is the Trump administration simply doesn't understand Mexico, which is possible given the fact that you've got no Latin America specialists on the National Security Council, let alone a Mexican specialist, and certainly none that are within the White House. Second, he understands and doesn't care. I think this is the least likely of the three options. Most likely, I think he understands and is killing two birds with one stone. He's appealing to his domestic political constituency and at the same time trying to keep Mexico intentionally off balance for trade negotiations. If this is the strategy, it's misguided because all he's doing is getting Mexico's nationalist hackles up and hardening their position when it comes to negotiating on trade. So let me briefly turn to trade. Unlike security, commerce is an area where a non-productive outcome is not the most likely scenario, but it is a distressingly likely scenario. The two administrations' bottom lines simply do not mesh. Trump wants to bring jobs back to the United States from Mexico and reduce the trade deficit with Mexico, and has constantly returned to the idea of using taxes on Mexican imports to achieve these objectives. Mexico has made it clear that it will not accept this or any other outcome that undermines Mexican national interests. And given the domestic political context in Mexico, Mexican negotiators simply cannot be seen to accept an outcome that harms Mexican interests. Mexico also has some very good cards to play in the bilateral trade relationship. This is an issue area where Mexico is most vulnerable to Trump administration pressures. The structure of the Mexican economy makes it highly dependent on trade and capital flows with the United States. But it's also a place where the United States is vulnerable to Mexican pressure. The United States is more dependent on trade and capital flows with Mexico than most Americans realize, and Mexico is laying the groundwork for exploiting the many vulnerabilities the United States has. Mexico, first of all, has experience targeting taxes on trade to where they will exact the greatest political costs for the United States. They did this during the trucking dispute quite precisely, and they are setting the groundwork to do it again on the renegotiation of NAFTA. Mexico is experiencing negotiating as well with Argentina and Brazil. What they're negotiating is new sources for agricultural inputs, specifically corn. Mexico currently imports 80% of its corn from the United States and is looking for new sources of those corns to be able to target corn farmers with tariff provisions if need be. Thirdly, without NAFTA, trade in the bilateral relationship would revert to WTO compliant trade rates, tariff rates. For the United States, that's 3%. That's the rate that the United States charges on trade with the rest of the world. Mexico has a slightly higher rate, 8%. So that United States exports to Mexico would hurt more than Mexican exports to the United States. And on agricultural goods, Mexico's WTO compliant rate is 20%. So this outcome would hurt the United States more than it would hurt Mexico in terms of exports. And finally, Mexico has made it clear that it'll respond to any U.S. import taxes with taxes of its own on trade. Was my final comment. More productively, Mexico is also aggressively playing the China card. We've all heard the numbers that imports from Mexico into the United States contain 40% U.S. content. China, it's only 4%, and Mexico is using that fact with the Trump administration. But Mexico also realizes that the United States needs it to remain globally competitive. If the United States wants to reduce its trade deficit with China, it needs to trade with Mexico because we produce things together and produce things competitively together. And finally, if taxes are imposed on trade with Mexico, that's not going to lead those jobs to come back to the United States. It'll lead those jobs to go to another low-cost producer in order to be able to compete globally. And with that, I will finish my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Jose Martin, I think you're up.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. When Kim and I spoke about this panel, she and I agreed that it would be perhaps good that I share with you some of the stories of the last 25 years so that you can see how do we get here to this very strong cooperation between our customs administrations and whatever we do at the border. Well, almost 25 years ago, when I arrived here, we began negotiating a tax treaty between Mexico and the U.S. because we were starting negotiations on a free trade agreement that now we call NAFTA. We negotiated the tax and customs components of NAFTA, the uniform regulations to implement NAFTA, and we created 9 working groups at that time. But those working groups, it ran from IT, to try to harmonize our data requirements for customs, to labs. For example, our labs in customs, in both customs agencies, and actually the 3 customs agencies with Canada, to harmonize the methodologies on how do they analyze any goods so that our results of our labs will come up with the same the same result, and so that we will be classifying goods exactly the same way. On customs procedures, verifications of origin, etc. Then we moved on. After we completed that work, we created a broader working group that we call the U.S.-Mexico Border Working Group. And we divided the border in four regions. And in these working groups or subgroups, we focused on infrastructure projects. Our main goal was to move cargo out of the urban areas. And as you take a picture 25 years ago and today, you see that through time, we have been moving all the cargo out of the downtowns and all the cities, and all our projects now all our cargo, our bilateral trade moves through different areas with better planning and highways and bridges, etc. We created an enforcement working group because security has always been a very important piece of the equation here. Also a customs procedure working group. In the mid-90s, actually, we developed something that we call the North American Trade Automation Prototype. And we began moving trucks from one side to the other by identifying trucks with an RFID and things like that we were testing at the time. Then, of course, we had the unfortunate events of 9/11, and we had to rethink everything we were doing and try to inject more focus on security. And we did. And we created the U.S.-Mexico Partnership for Security and Prosperity. We created 10 working groups. 3 of those working groups were focused on the border, and many of them on customs and security. Our working groups were always developing initiatives, programs that have the two components, security and facilitation, at the same time. And later I will mention some of these initiatives, and you'll see how each of them has a strong facilitation component, but at the same time a strong or stronger security component. Because we, in customs, in our DNA, we cannot accept that we're going to facilitate trade if we don't secure trade first. It's in our DNA. We're customs. We're not the Red Cross. We're not an NGO. We are customs. And so we have to focus on security first, both the U.S. Customs and Mexico Customs, so that we can facilitate trade. And that's how we began developing many initiatives. Let me give you an example. It was in the early 2000s when, actually after the 9/11 events, that when the SAFE framework of standards in the World Customs Organization was developed with Commissioner Bonner at the time, and we began working on many initiatives so that we can implement the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism in Mexico with Mexican companies to create our own program. And at the same time to provide facilitation for those companies that decided to walk the extra mile, and then we'll say, well, we have to deliver on something for you because you have increased your security standards in your processes. And for example, we developed these fast lanes, the free and secure trade lanes. And just to give you an example, or just a number, today 41% of the Mexican exports in terms of value and 25% in terms of volume to the United States move through fast lanes. That's more than what the U.S. imports from the UK, France, and Spain combined, more than what the U.S. imports from many European countries combined in Asian countries. So these companies, the CTPAT companies that secure their supply chain and move cargo through the border, they do it through these fast lanes, and they get this benefit. Then we decided that we have to take a next step. When the new administration arrived in the U.S., we moved forward with more interagency level cooperation. We created the 21st century border concept. But at the same time, of course, Mexico Customs and U.S. Customs, they continue working under their own arrangements, under their own agreements. We developed a declaration of principles. Actually, Mike and I redacted that. We worked on that document. And then a bilateral strategic plan, a customs bilateral strategic plan with very specific initiatives that I will mention some of them. These bilateral strategic plan had all these components, security components and trade facilitation components and infrastructure modernization components. Through these working groups that we created under these Declaration of Principles and Bilateral Strategic Plan, we began reporting to the 21st Century Border, the other working groups, interagency working groups that were created between the two governments. Let me mention some of the initiatives that we have developed in the last few years. So just to summarize what we've done in the last 25 years and where we are today. cargo pre-inspection. We have programs on cargo pre-inspection. We have U.S. and Mexico customs officers working together at the same facility, inspecting cargo, clearing cargo, releasing cargo, getting data, analyzing data, sharing data, and processing cargo at, I would say, much less expensive process, through a much less expensive process, but at the same time much faster. We started in Laredo, Texas, at the Laredo, Texas airport to ship air cargo to 8 Mexican airports. This pilot works for the aerospace, auto, and electronics industry sectors. And through this program, for example, a shipment that is inspected in Laredo, Texas is not inspected when it arrives to Mexico. And companies have actually shared with us the results, and they say that they are saving 50% in terms of cost and 60% in terms of time, or wait times, or processing times. We are looking at expanding that well, we opened the second one in January 2016 in Otay Mesa for Mexican agriculture products, and we are looking at expanding that one as well. There's a third one coming in San Jerónimo, Chihuahua. And we agreed that we would look at U.S. airports, more U.S. airports for cargo bound to Mexico. But this is a magnificent program, and it shows exactly how can we work very well when we work together, and having customs officers from both sides working together at the same facility, fully uniformed, fully armed, because we had to go through these amendments in our legislation to allow for this. And the private sector, of course, is very happy about it, the companies that participate in them. There's a much bigger, larger, or more ambitious initiative in the program. It's called the Harmonized Cargo Manifest Initiative. We are harmonizing all the data requirements for all the cargo manifests for all modes of transportation. Today, we are about to complete, actually, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, the harmonization of our rail manifest for northbound cargo. So rail companies are filing, of course, electronically, exactly the same data set to both of us. That facilitates trade for railroad companies, but at the same time increases compliance and increases security for both countries. And air, Mexico actually implemented the new air cargo manifest in 2015. The U.S. is getting there. I guess in the next few months, the U.S. will catch up, and then we will have a harmonized air cargo manifest pretty soon. For maritime, that's the opposite. We decided in Mexico to copy-paste the U.S. maritime cargo manifest, and we did, and it's going to be completed again in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And on truck, we have begun discussions on how to harmonize our truck manifests. I would say that by the end of this year, well, actually, before the summer, we will have completely harmonized rail, air, and maritime, and truck during 2018. So by 2018, we would have a completely harmonized cargo manifest, both customs agencies getting exactly the same data, trade facilitated to all the participants, but at the same time, increasing compliance and increasing security in our bilateral trade. We also reached a mutual recognition agreement between CTPAT and the Mexican Authorized Economic Operator Program. And we did the same with Canada. The U.S. have the same with Canada. And now we're talking about how to trilateralize this arrangement, how to make it more harmonized and mutually recognize our program, so that a shipment from Montreal to Monterrey, 2 cities with the same name in different languages, but they will actually go through our customs processes in a harmonized way and completely secure way. We are sharing rail images at the border. 17% of our trade moves on rail. And let me go back about 15 years or 20 years, when Mexico privatized rail, because it was a state-owned company, a very inefficient state-owned company. And when we privatized rail, at that time, only 1% or less moved on rail. Today, it's 17%, and we projected in about 10 years, we'll reach around 30% of our bilateral trade to be moved on rail, which is the same average that you have between US and Canada. So I guess we're heading towards a North American way of moving cargo, and that will impact all the decisions we make for infrastructure at the border. But knowing this and having non-intrusive inspection systems on both sides of the border, we are capable now of sharing images and facilitating the process for rail cargo, but at the same time increasing security on both sides of the border. Data exchange, we exchange billions and billions of data elements every day for every shipment crossing the border, for information on passengers, on cargo and vehicles. And this will, our intention is to keep increasing this cooperation. Infrastructure, you've heard about some of the projects we launched last year, the Tijuana Airport pedestrian bridge that makes the Tijuana Airport a binational airport so that people in Southern California, they don't have to travel long distances to catch a plane to Asia. They can get it from the Tijuana Airport. But at the same time, we opened another port in Guadalupe Tornillo in Chihuahua, Texas, in the Chihuahua-Texas border. But most importantly, I would say that infrastructure, our most ambitious program now is the Otay Mesa East project. We are working on that. Otay Mesa East will be the first infrastructure project that we design together, we build together, and we will operate together. CBP and Mexico Customs and the Mexican Immigration Institute, we have completed the design of the processes for both cargo and pedestrians and passenger vehicles. So now our engineers from both sides are designing that port based on these processes that we have just developed. On the enforcement side, we have a strong enforcement working group. We have a trade transparency unit. We share data. We analyze data together. And with that, we also have a program on risk management and targeting. We have, Mexico Customs has 2 analysts here at the National Targeting Center. There's connection between the National Targeting Center and our targeting center in Querétaro in Mexico. And 24/7, there's a 24/7 cooperation. We do joint risk management and targeting for cargo approaching North America or departing from North America. I think I will stop there, but we have a long list of things that we've been doing in the last 25 years, and that shows how this strong cooperation actually delivers on both trade facilitation and security. I would finalize by saying that what we've been doing actually is developing a North American customs platform. If you put all the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle together, at the end of the day, what we're building or what we're constructing is a North American customs platform. And that's why we believe we should preserve that and expand that cooperation, because we both win by having this data exchange, risk analysis together, targeting, good infrastructure, and always with the vision of facilitating trade and improving security in all of our projects. That's what we've been doing. I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Jose Martin. Mike?
Thanks. So I'm hoping to kind of shoot the gap a little bit between Pamela and Jose Martin's presentations. I want to, but to do that, I want to take a step back, and I realize that for people who have been following Mexico, the little narrative I'm going to talk through is not going to be surprising, but it's important to set the stage, I think, for what's happened in the last decade with our relationship. So the U.S.-Mexico border is the most crossed border in the world. It's 2,000 miles long. But I think if we look back at what we've done in the past, it provides some really interesting insights into how we might look at things going forward. So the border was created as we currently have it, roughly, right? I mean, there was a minor adjustment following this, but in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the result of a war. And so the border, from the moment of its creation, embodied this tension. There was a friction that existed at the border. Over the ensuing 150 years, there was an asymmetry that developed economically, politically, but the border provided a point of parity, right? There was a place, it was the place where national sovereignty could be exerted equally, because Mexico had as much control of the border as the United States did. So even though there were political and economic differences, the border became this line of contention. From the Mexican side, then, the border and things north, it was viewed with suspicion. There were sovereignty concerns. It became sort of this symbol of the ominous figure in the north. For the United States, but conversely, it was also a place of economic prosperity. So it sort of was schizophrenic in a sense. From the United States perspective, though, it was equally schizophrenic, right? We sort of looked down at, you know, the poor, corrupt neighbors to the south, and yet relied on them for labor. And it was a reliable, respected source of labor. I know my mother grew up in rural Arizona and talks talks regularly about people coming across the border to help in the ranch. And that's just the way business was run back then. So the old adage about foreign countries that happen to be neighbors was, I think, is pretty accurate description. This played out in national policies. What was talked about in the DF and DC didn't really have a lot of resonance with what was actually happening at the border, where we had communities that were interconnected, where people had lived there for generations, and it was really the third country, as people described. And so there was this very strange dissonance in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, where politically there was one thing in the lives of the people who lived on the border, it was something else, and for the most part it was largely ignored. That changed. We saw NAFTA came, we saw the increased buildup through the Bush administration of the border infrastructure that we currently have. But the real change, sort of the ground shift, in my personal opinion, happened in 2007, 2008 with the advent of the Merida Initiative. The thing that changed was that both countries stood up and for the first time, I think, acknowledged that each had a responsibility for the challenges that the other was facing. The Bush administration stood up and said, yes, it is true that the money and the guns that goes to the cartels largely comes from the United States, because we are the largest consumer drug market in the world. And the Mexican government stood up and said, yes, and it is true that our cartels are providing and producing those drugs and a source of violence. And we both then said, we each can't solve this individually, we have to work collectively to do this. And the Merida Initiative was the framework that allowed that structure to be implemented, where the U.S. provided foreign assistance, and the Mexicans then matched and exceeded that effort with the money that they put into their own security and trade programs. And so that really, in my personal opinion, was the beginning of what we see now as a joint approach to dealing with common sets of issues. That was primarily security, though there was a lot of economic stuff built into it, but the narrative was primarily a security narrative. That then continued to mature in the Obama Calderon 21st Century Border Declaration, which happened in 2010. What that did was it took then this relationship that was largely security and started to infuse the notion of border management as part of our bilateral relationship, that it wasn't just the big issues of security and economics, but actually that managing the border was an important part of our bilateral relationship, and that we needed to do it together, which was consistent with the language that had been used to talk about the Merida Initiative. And then we saw a further development of that with the high-level economic dialogue that was started, where again we started talking about economic issues within the context of joint management. And so over the course of this about 5-year period, we developed a series of intellectual or conceptual groundings that built a path for us to engage. I'm going to sort of tick them off a little bit, but I think they could be expanded or modified. This is just a short list. So the first is we reframed previously contentious issues as joint issues. We started talking about them jointly, that we had common shared interests. And that was an important part because it allowed each of us the political space to operate together. Secondly, we accepted responsibility for those joint issues, that each of us acknowledged we had a responsibility for the challenges that we were each facing and that we could only meet our own responsibilities by working with the other partner. Third, we started to operationalize what had previously been political problems. We took it out of the sphere of politics and pushed it down into the area of collaboration and operation. And that has the magical effect of allowing people to cooperate. Because you're no longer debating the merits of a particular position, you're starting to try to figure out how to solve a particular problem, not at the political level, but at the operational level. And the third, and this is sort of my own parochial belief coming from DHS, is we started to redefine what border flows were. We stopped looking at the border as sort of this line in the sand that runs east and west, and we started talking about flows as they go north and south. Because we began to recognize that, for instance, trade and migratory flows coming up through Mexico didn't always start in Mexico. Sometimes they started in areas further south or in other hemispheres, and they just came through. And so to secure those flows, we need to actually look beyond just the physical border. And in fact, our physical border became the last line of defense, not the first. The first line of defense often was much further away. From a DHS specific perspective, these frameworks then allowed us to make a number of sort of connections that then allowed us to work with our partners on both security, migratory, and economic issues. So what these are first, we began to see that borders are multidimensional and can't be managed by a single entity. That the idea that the United States alone could manage one side of the border didn't really match with reality. There is another side, and the Mexicans are on that side, and that we can really only manage the border together, right? Because they have half of the responsibility. So that was one of the things. The second is we, as Pamela noted, we started talking about national and economic security as a partnership. That our national and economic security is dependent upon Mexico's national economic security, and vice versa, and Canada, I would add as well. Third is we started talking about security and facilitation as two sides of the same coin. For a long time, it was framed as you could either facilitate goods or secure goods, but you can't do both. We then said, no, actually, the more secure a person or a product is, the faster we can move it through. And so we removed the dichotomy, which wasn't actually representative of reality anyway. And we began to frame flows. The more secure a flow is, the faster it goes. Relatedly, we started using risk management. We started to recognize, I think very clearly, that not everything poses the same amount of risk, that some things are more risky than others. And in fact, the more we know about something, the less risk is attached to it because we know about it, and therefore it can move more rapidly. And so we began the process, and we're still doing this, as Jose Martin pointed out, with some of the harmonized manifests and the trade programs, where we're actually starting to get deeper information about specific flows so we can move them more rapidly. And that's all based on risk management. And then last is the notion of joint responsibility and co-management, that it underlines basically everything we do. The reason I bring those particular things out is I think what we've shown is that we know as binational partners how to work together. We've sort of established what the processes and the ideas look like. And I think, I think we've moved to the point where the relationship that we currently have may have bumps along the way, and I suppose that's likely no matter what. But that the idea that we would go back to 1950, I think, is silly, right? We've crossed some threshold where we may have challenges, but we're not going to go back, in my personal opinion, to where we were a decade or 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago. And third, I think the fact of the matter is because of our shared border, our futures are interconnected, and there's really no way around that. And so maybe I'll just leave it at that, and then we can move from there.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. I think to summarize what I just heard, which this is the thing that's fascinating about the U.S.-Mexico relationship, particularly at the border, when you start to dive into what is actually going on and what goes on every single day between the two governments, it's you begin to realize that when the political relationship at the national level maybe isn't at its highest moment in memory, what is underlying it, both as a positive and what may be at risk if we don't proceed in a way that tries to mend the breach. There's one question I wanted to ask either Jose Martin or Mike. An acronym slipped in, and I think we should probably explain it for the audience. When you sit in rooms full of people talking about North America, I actually made a joke at a meeting once. I gave an entire sentence that was formed entirely of acronyms related to cross-border trade, and everyone in the room understood me. But in this context, could you talk a little bit about CTPAT and what it is? Thanks.
Well, it's a U.S. program. Before CTPAT, there was this Business Anti-Smuggling Coalition. It was a private sector driven initiative where the companies approached U.S. Customs at the time. CBP didn't exist yet, and so they approached U.S. Customs and they actually asked them. If I do this and this and that to secure my supply chain from point of origin to final point of destination, would you give me something in return? Would you facilitate the process of my shipments? And U.S. Customs said yes. And at that time, the BASC, as we know it, the Business Anti-Smuggling Coalition, flourished somehow, no? And thrive through the years in the 90s. Then we have 9/11, and U.S. Customs, CBP, newly created, and actually Commissioner Bonner pushed this idea of the Customs needed to create its own program. So it took BASC as it was and improved BASC with some additional elements. And actually, he brought this idea to the global arena at the World Customs Organization. And he, with other countries, actually was a member of that working group. There were 6 countries, and I was a member. I used to travel a lot to Brussels. And we developed the safe framework of standards that the WCO developed. So the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism is the evolution of BASC, where the private sector is very supportive of it, as long, of course, if they get some facilitation in the process, no? So the program looks at the lighting, the background checks of your personnel, in where do you get the packaging, where do you do this, the whole supply chain from point of origin until it reaches its final destination, to make sure that all of the security elements for that shipment are combined into that shipment so that when it reaches the U.S. border, it's secure. And with the safe framework of standards from WCO, we began developing similar programs. In Mexico, we created something that was called the NEEC, and then we changed the name to be compliant with or consistent with WCO, with the World Customs Organization, and now it's an authorized economic operator program, as all the countries in the world have it like that. I believe Bonner's idea was a magnificent idea, a brilliant idea. At the end of the day, I'm not saying that the private sector is not to be trusted with the development of these programs. Actually, it worked for many years. But after 9/11, the world changed somehow. So, and what Bonner did is actually took that, improved that, and make it globally. We cannot live in a world without supply chain security programs these days. We simply can't. And Mexico has been extremely supportive of this, and that's why 41% of our exports to the U.S. are CTPAT compliant. Or let me say, authorized economic operator compliant at the same time. The program that we have together, this mutual recognition agreement, we intend to provide the same benefits or the equivalent benefits to companies participating on both sides of the border. So when they reach to our port, they will get the express lanes or fast lanes, or they will get reduced inspections based on risk management, of course, and that's what CTPAT is. But it was a brilliant idea, and the private sector continues to be very supportive of it.
Mike, did you want to comment on it?
No, only to say that when I have questions, I call Jose too.
He really is the institutional memory. One thing that has come up, I think, very clearly in all the discussion, Jose, all of you have mentioned it, that there are many stakeholders in this relationship, and sometimes we think about the relationship being between, the United States and Mexico, and we talk about Washington and Mexico City. But part of the reason why we invited guests today from border states is to bring in the broader perspective on this and the broader conversation, both the private sectors and the people. And I wondered if any of you would like to comment on kind of the cross-border community relationships and how you see the development of particularly at key points of entry, the communities on either side.
I'll make one comment, just really briefly, and then let these folks comment. So the one thing I think that's interesting is I feel like the border communities themselves have always viewed themselves as unique, right? I mean, we have the Columbus Day celebration, which has been going on forever, which, if you've ever been, is a really sort of odd, I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's a really unique celebration with the abrazos, and I mean, it's really remarkable what that sort of symbolizes. And the border from San Diego to Texas is different. There's different geography, different traditions and people, and the border. Everything looks different. But the fact of the matter is that the border communities understand the border better than everybody else. The challenge, of course, is that the border communities have not done as well in talking about the border as everyone else. Their perspective, I think, is probably undervalued and probably underrepresented in the national dialogue. And I don't quite know how that gets fixed. I mean, when you have politicians at the national level in D.C. and Mexico City talking about the border, it is often the case that the things they say don't always align with the way the people in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez would talk about the border, the way the people in Nogales and Nogales would talk about the border. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I do think, though, that there's an opportunity for the border constituent groups to be more vocal and more forthcoming about the things they see, the perspective they have, what the border means to them, and what the bilateral relationship means. And I think that's an area where we have some room to grow in terms of representation. I think we're making small steps in the border infrastructure conversations, for instance. The local voices are much more prominent, and that's good. That's the way it should be. We have like the BBBXG with the Bilateral Bridges and Border Crossing Working Group. We have other, through the 21st Century Border Process, we have the infrastructure group where we can really talk about those issues. But infrastructure may, and I guess on some trade issues, there's good collaboration between governments at the local level, but it's not the border communities themselves necessarily. But I think there's an opportunity for that to be injected more prominently in the dialogue.
We, from a customs perspective, we have created port security committees. All ports of entry at the border, they have these port security committees. They meet regularly, our port directors from both sides, and they address security issues, very specific security issues. And we took this approach because instead of having this 3,000-mile-long screwdriver from Washington and Mexico City, we said, no, you have to address these issues locally, and you have to invite the trade community, and you have to discuss this. And this is what we've been doing. And actually, we've been replicating this our southern border, with Guatemala. We're developing these port security committees because it's a good idea to address local issues, security issues, and then see how can we solve them, or how can we support in the process to solve them. These committees have also evolved from what we call trade committees. So we maintain those both because at the Port Security Committee sometimes we have to discuss some security issues, in confidential way somehow to address these security issues, but we also keep the trade issues, the trade committees. I'm sorry.
Let me just add that the border communities are unique. They are as different from the rest of their individual countries as the two countries are toward one another. What I mean by that is that border communities are seen as both distant and peripheral from their capitals. and they're not understood by the politicians, most politicians in the capitals. I think we really need to differentiate between border communities and border states, because border communities are also different than border states. I'm from Los Angeles, which is completely different than being from San Diego. Our relationship with Mexico is really on a state-to-state level. We're not living on the border in Los Angeles. And the attitude about the border is distinct when you get into the border communities. And just to reemphasize what Mike was saying, they need to have a louder voice in how we go about managing the border, because it's their reality, and it's not a reality that's well represented in Washington and Mexico City.
Let me add something to that. In Mexico Customs, we have a saying when new personnel arrives to headquarters and they start visiting the ports of entry. So they have, some of them come with these great ideas to solve all the problems of the border. And we always say, you know what, if you've been to a port of entry, you've been to a port of entry, just one port of entry. You have to know each port of entry. So the local communities know much better than us. And we should rely we should keep relying on their input, and see how can we support them. They know their issues better, and we should support them.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. We're going to take about a 15-minute break before we start with our second panel, so please be back around 10:15. I want to thank everyone for what I think was a really interesting and necessary discussion. I appreciate your coming. Thank you very much. I want to briefly introduce our second panel here, and the idea is to focus a bit more on the challenges of border infrastructure, points of entry, and also the various models that we might look at as we think through the future path that the two countries will want to take regarding points of entry in particular. First, we have Matt Rooney, who is currently the Director for Economic Growth and the head of the North American Competitiveness Initiative at the George W. Bush Presidential Library in Dallas. In keeping with transparency and full disclosure, I am particularly fond of the work because I was fortunate enough to have been invited to participate in it a few years ago. Matt was also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Canada and Mexico at the State Department, and he's going to lead us off and will be followed by Juan Villa, who has recently joined CSIS as a non-resident senior associate. He is the regional manager of the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. He spent more than 15 years researching freight transportation and logistics, and his expertise is frequently sought out by both the U.S. and Mexican governments. We also have joining us Andrew Rudman, who is Managing Director of Manat Jones Global Strategies, and he's here today on behalf of SANDAG, which is the San Diego Association of Governments, to discuss a point of entry that you heard mentioned in our first panel, which is Otay Mesa East, which is the cutting-edge new model for points of entry. In a past life, little known, Andrew also worked at the Department of Commerce in the NAFTA office. So I'd like to welcome our panel and hand it over to Matt. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kim. Juan Carlos, Andrew, great to be here with you. Great to be here in a hometown crowd. I would normally in this place say it's great to be back in Washington, but it's actually really nice to be in Dallas, Texas, under the current circumstances. And so I'm delighted to have this opportunity. Kim, thank you very much. And Mike, thank you very much for the invitation here to CSIS. I was very pleased to see that it's part of your presentation of yourself that you are a member of our working group. That's a great bit of validation that I am happy to accept. So Kim's already mentioned, my name is Matthew Rooney. I run the Economic Growth Program at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. I just might say a couple of things about the Bush Institute, which is perhaps not widely known in Washington. Talk a little more about our initiative and how we've done it, why we decided to focus on North America, and what we're doing by way of next steps. So the Bush Institute is a nonpartisan think and do tank located on the campus of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. founded by President and Mrs. Bush upon leaving the White House in 2009 to follow up on a number of substantive areas that they felt particularly strongly about while in office. Among other things, there is a military service initiative. Some of you may have seen President Bush on the Today Show this morning promoting his latest book, which is a coffee table book of portraits of wounded warriors that he has painted. And it's a very affecting book. It's part of his initiative to keep faith with the wounded warriors that he sent into harm's way. And the proceeds from the book will support the military service initiative. It's one of the key initiatives of the Institute, which works with the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration and other stakeholders to smooth the transition from military to civilian life. There's a large program that follows up on the President's engagement on education reform within the United States. There are a number of leadership development programs directed at mid-career professionals in the United States. There's one for young leaders in emerging democracies like Burma and South Sudan. And there is one directed at encouraging women's leadership in North Africa and the Middle East. And then there is mine, the Economic Growth Initiative, which began life as a series of conferences in 2011, 2012, which led to a book that was published in 2012 by the Institute called The 4% Solution, which explored the policy agenda that would be required to return the United States to a sustained path of 4% annual growth. If you read that book, it is a very large agenda which includes all kinds of domestic initiatives, tax levels, regulatory issues, labor market policies, small business promotion policies, a whole gamut of things, including global engagement, openness to international trade and investment, and immigration. And so based on that, we thought we would focus our efforts in the first instance on the global engagement piece. And this all began about 2 years ago. When I came about a year and a half ago, we were thinking about how to start and where to find a space that other think tanks and other organizations were not already focused on. And it occurred to us that North America and NAFTA is really the cornerstone of how the United States engages with the global economy. It's really the DNA that underlies U.S. trade agreements up to and including TPP in many ways. And therefore, it seemed like a place that needed some focus. Also, President Bush felt quite strongly that already 2 years ago when he started to think about these things, NAFTA was misunderstood, and the dynamic and the benefits of it for the United States were misunderstood in large parts of the United States population, a prescient thought on his part. And so he asked us to focus on North America to try to develop a body of work that would push back against the idea that North American economic integration, NAFTA, have been harmful for the United States. We feel very strongly that they've been positive for the United States, and that there are still more benefits to be had from those relationships with our immediate neighbor. On the screen are quotes from the President's remarks at a presentation we made right after the election in November, where we presented our North America analysis and our North America recommendations. He is committed to the idea that it is a win-win-win, and that the relationship, the economic relationship among our partners has been positive for our country. So in analyzing this problem, we did two kind of data-driven things and one more policy-driven thing. The first data-driven thing was our competitiveness scorecard. You can find it on our website, bushcenter.org/scorecard. And what the scorecard is an amalgamation of 4 databases of economic competitiveness, openness, ease of doing business, or freedom, specifically the World Economic Forum's Economic Openness Index, the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, the Wall Street Journal Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index, and an index of economic freedom compiled by an organization in Canada called the Fraser Institute, which takes a slightly more individual liberty-focused look at economic freedom. And we took those 4 databases and we combined them into a single normalized database, and we sliced those criteria according to our own groupings, business environment, legal system, and so on, you can see on the screen. And then we broke those down. So this database, which is available on the website, you can look at it and play with the data, covers 101 countries over the last, I think it goes back 8 years now. And what we did was we looked at North America as a group. So we compiled a score for North America, which is a simple arithmetic average of the scores for the 3 countries. And we benchmark it on the website against the scores for other major trading groups and also major trading countries. Spoiler alert, North America is the most competitive trading group. We looked at APEC, we looked at the Pacific Alliance, we look at the TPP group, and we look at Mercosur just for sake of completion, although it's kind of shooting fish in a barrel. But in any case, the bottom line is North America is more competitive than the others. If you actually, and if, as I said, this is a straight up arithmetic average. If you weight the scores by GDP, for example, then you get North America far and away outcompeting other groups because the predominance of the United States and the GDP numbers for North America are such that the GDP weighted score for North America approaches the US score. Even if you look at individual trading countries and compare them with North America competes in the range of the Germanys and the and the UKs, I mean, the kind of major trading countries. So the idea that North America is not competitive in the world is not borne out by these numbers, at least. One thing that does appear when you look at the numbers is a range of scores among the North American countries. So Mexico, for a number of understandable reasons, particularly institutional issues, tends to score a little lower than Canada and the United States. And so the question arises, well, doesn't that drag us down? And that struck us as a particularly sensitive point and something worth exploring further. So we undertook to look at the economic integration process because we felt that unappreciated in those earlier numbers, some portion of the high score that the United States has arises from the fact that we are integrated with Canada and Mexico. And so we looked at that integration process in terms of the change since NAFTA, since 1990, in GDP, per capita GDP, and employment levels in the 3 countries as the trade and investment relationships among the 3 countries have intensified. So you can see here, for example, as on the left-hand graph, as trade among the North American countries has gone from about $500 billion a year to almost $1.5 trillion a year, North America's gross GDP has expanded dramatically. You can see the U.S., there's that blue zone at the bottom. So the idea that somehow that North American integration process has harmed our ability to grow, certainly our economy has grown dramatically during that period. You can play around with these numbers on the website as well. You can see here, for example, that North American trade with the rest of the world, as trade among the North American countries has increased, North American trade with the rest of the world has increased by a larger gross margin, and in fact, U.S. trade with the rest of the world has increased by significantly more. So again, the idea that somehow we are being pushed out of or outcompeted in global markets as a result of the North American integration process isn't borne out by these numbers. So with those numbers in the background, we convened an expert working group. We felt that it was very important to take a trilateral focus because we think that the trilateral dynamic is important as opposed to a dual bilateral dynamic. And so I think almost uniquely among organizations like ours in the United States, our working group actually comprises experts from business, government, and academia from all 3 countries. And we brought that group together. Kim was a member of that group from the outset. We brought that group together a number of times over the course of late 2015 and 2016. We met in Dallas a couple of times. We met in San Diego, Tijuana, There's our allusion this morning has already been made to the Cross-Border Express project. There are a number of other interesting things happening there with kind of cross-border infrastructure issues and the cross-border community that exists there. We also took the group to Detroit Windsor, which has a number of interesting things happening with cross-border infrastructure. And we focused our discussion on energy issues, border infrastructure issues, and human capital development. And that group then gave rise to a series of policy recommendations, which the President rolled out for us, President Bush rolled out for us in November of last year. We were deliberately very focused in our recommendations. We didn't want to write another kind of 300-page paper with 175 recommendations. And so we kept, Kim may remember, my kind of mantra in this whole thing was we want a narrow in focus but broad in impact. We want initiatives that the governments could do together in partnership with the private sector and other groups that can be measured, that can take place in a specific period of time that are, given that we're talking about public policy, relatively easy, but that would have broad impact. And so we produced our 2 key investments in North American competitiveness. Again, this is all on our website. We believe that economic integration among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico will strengthen the U.S. economy and create opportunity across the continent. I actually want to do these in opposite. I want to focus on recommendation 1 here. Recommendation 2, which I'm going to not focus on so much this morning, relates to workforce development. We perceive that, and our experts brought us to the conclusion that all 3 countries share kind of analogous labor gap and internal labor mobility issues without even touching on the question of labor mobility among the 3 countries. And we think that a way to deal with that would be a public-private partnership to create uniform or comparable standards for training and certification of workers across different industries across the North American space. We think that would facilitate the investment process. It would facilitate the process of recruitment and training and improve the just the integrity and the managerial coherence of the supply chains, again, without even addressing the problem of the question of labor mobility. Although I was in Mexico City 10 days ago, and there is heightened interest in this issue, in this idea of labor standards across North America in Mexico, as they start to get ready for the possibility that large numbers of Mexicans may be deported from the United States and show up in Mexico with educational certifications and training certifications gained in the United States, and ensuring that those are usable in Mexico is a challenge they're thinking about. So the key recommendation I want to talk about this morning, and I don't want to hog the time, is in looking at the infrastructure problem, and it was discussed to a certain extent in the prior panel. The issue of cross-border infrastructure in the North American space is a particular challenge, largely because of the way the United States handles the permitting, planning, and financing of that kind of infrastructure. I was struck by this conversation in the previous panel talking about the need to strengthen the local voices in this process. In a way, I think that's an interesting conundrum. Coming from Texas, we don't necessarily want to invite the federal government to take a larger role in things. But the fact of the matter is that 25 years after NAFTA, it strikes me as extraordinary that we don't have anything but the very beginnings of a process among the governments to plan infrastructure. There's literally no mechanism whereby you can look at North America as a holistic whole and ask yourself, where does the infrastructure need to be 20, 30, 50 years from now in order to support the economic activity that we hope and expect and want to take place. That is an extraordinary thing. We are the only trading group among all those other groups that I mentioned earlier. We're the only one that does not have an infrastructure planning process, and we're the only one that does not have an infrastructure bank, an infrastructure financing facility that can respond to that planning process. Part of this has to do with the U.S. Presidential permitting process. which requires you to have an affirmative determination by the Department of State that a given piece of cross-border infrastructure would be in the national interest. We think that's dysfunctional and weird. After 25 years of NAFTA, we think that presumption should be reversed and that a piece of infrastructure should be presumed to be in the national interest unless the President or the Secretary of State finds otherwise within a given period of time. We think that would smooth the process of planning border infrastructure. We think that it would make it more transparent. And then the issue of local control, obviously you want communities to be involved when they're talking about land use and such things, but it's still strange if you think about how the border infrastructure is financed as a subset of highway infrastructure through the Highway Trust Fund, which is apportioned by the federal government to the states according to a formula, which has no factor in it for whether a state is a border state or not. So you're essentially asking, I won't say Texas because it's a large state, let's just say New Mexico or Arizona, you're essentially asking them to pay extra for border infrastructure, which the state of Oklahoma doesn't have to do. Although border infrastructure is a national equity and has economic impacts well beyond the state in question. So we think there needs to be a process to overcome these weaknesses, and we think that a great way to do that would be a border infrastructure bank, analogous to the North American Development Bank, which is already in existence with the headquarters in San Antonio, Texas, as a U.S.-Mexico financial institution. And we think that that bank could take on that role of creating that database and providing that kind of intelligence and planning function. And it could also start to rescue border infrastructure from the clutches of the annual appropriations process and the Highway Trust Fund, and enable also private sector funding to flow alongside public sector funding to finance border infrastructure. So the model of the North American Development Bank exists. It's a perfectly reasonable way to do these things. You know, for a relatively modest amount of money up front, $200–300 million from each government of the three, if you brought Canada in, you would trigger something like $8 or $9 billion in investment in border infrastructure, which, interestingly, is just about comparable to some of the estimates for how much kind of deferred maintenance and investment in border infrastructure is there. And when you look at things like, I alluded a moment ago to the project at Detroit-Windsor, you look at things like the proposed new bridge there, which the United States permitted, and then turned right around and informed our Canadian friends that if they wanted to build a bridge, they were welcome to do so, but they would have to pay for the whole thing. They would also have to pay for the highway approaches on the U.S. side, which, to add insult to industry, become part of the state of Michigan's contribution to the Federal Highway Trust Fund, triggering federal money that they can use elsewhere in the state of Michigan. And they would have to build our inspection facility. It just seems to me like the kind of thing that a grown-up country shouldn't do. And this kind of mechanism would obviate some of that. So I'll skip recommendation 2 pretty much. Next steps, we remain committed to these things despite the unfolding political dynamic between the U.S. and Mexico. I mentioned having been to Mexico City, made a similar presentation to business and government groups, to quite an interested set of audiences in those presentations. Have also made a similar presentation in Ottawa, and we continue to make the case that these are cost-effective, useful ways of gaining additional value, and in fact increasing the productivity of our supply chain and our labor force, and ultimately increasing our income. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here today and to make these points, and appreciate everyone's attention and look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I think next up we'll have Juan Villa, who will explain to us on the day-to-day how the border actually works, I hope.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the invitation and for being part of the CSIS. I'm very proud, and I hope I can add some value. So, again, as Kim mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit of what's really going on the ground at the ports of entry. I have been doing research and consulting at borders for more than 25 years now. Probably not as much as Jose, but I'm getting there. But anyway, what I would like to touch today is U.S.-Mexico border trade, some statistics, go quickly over those, and then the actual border crossing process, because I'm pretty sure there's some people in the room that are not familiar with the process itself. And then some potential alternatives, some of them following what Matt mentioned, but also some other ones as well. So, as you can see here on this slide, most of the trade between U.S. and Mexico is done by truck. 83% is by truck and rail, and of that, probably about 60% is done by truck itself. There's 25 border crossings that handle trucks at the U.S.-Mexico border, and from those, I'll show you how many of those really handle most of that trade. And this has been growing, the truck trade has been growing increasingly fast. Between 95 and 2016, it's 4.7 times, and the exports has been growing 4.4 and 5% respectively. So again, it's humongous between 95 when NAFTA started and today, it's 5 times more with roughly the same number of ports of entry. Again, this is the actual number of trucks. The previous graph showed you the value, but this is the actual number of trucks. It's 5.5 million trucks cross the U.S.-Mexico, and this is only in one direction. And the way the process works, usually those trucks go back and forth on a daily basis. So again, this is almost twice as what was moved in 1995. And then this is the interesting thing. From those 25 ports of entry, there's 4 of them handle 3/4 or 75% of the total incoming trucks. So basically, port of entry includes 2 crossings, especially in El Paso, there's 2 crossings. In Laredo, there's 2 crossings. And again, Otay Mesa, only 1 right now, but hopefully another one soon. And then also the other one in McAllen, far. So again, 6 crossings handle 75% of the total volume. So you can ask why is that happening? Well, the key question here is who makes that decision? Who makes a decision of where to send that particular crossing? For those of you not familiar, I mean, it's difficult to read, but Laredo handles 4,600 trucks a day, roughly. And that's, again, in one direction only. And the reason why is because the shippers, the carriers have made the decision that this is a place where they need to cross, and there's facilities there, warehousing, custom brokers that operate there that can handle that traffic in an efficient way. But that again creates congestion. And one of the reasons why is even though supposedly the transportation is free, after NAFTA was agreed, the transportation, trucks from Mexico could cross into the U.S., there's still a lot of complications to doing that. In the upper part of the graphic, you can see a shipment, say, from Mexico into the U.S. So a long-haul tractor picks up that truck load, say, in Mexico City or Querétaro, San Luis, goes to the border in Laredo, then it drops a box there, and then a drayage truck or a transfer or a burrero will cross that particular shipment into the U.S. It's dropped in Laredo, Texas, and then it's picked up by a long-haul truck. And why is that? Because truckers don't want to have a very expensive newer truck to be stuck at the border for 2, 3, 4 hours. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is because there's still some paperwork that needs to be filed at the border in order to cross. And then on the southbound movement is similar story, adding one more wrinkle, which is the Mexican custom broker has to file papers in order to move into Mexico. So again, there's an additional stop going there. The NAFTA program is the NAFTA plan, original plan was the one below, which is similar to what happens at the Canadian border. You can just cross with a Canadian tractor and go into say, Detroit or even further, and then move back with another load. So there's a lot of rules. The cabotage rule also impacts this position. That means that a Mexican carrier cannot have, say, take a load in Detroit and then move with that load and drop it in Houston and then pick another one and go back to Mexico. So that's another issue that impacts the way that this is handled at the border. So that creates several problems. First, you have a lot of empty movements back and forth because you need to move those tractors or those trailers to pick up another load. So that creates also issues for CBP, Customs and Border Protection, because they have to handle a higher number of trucks to be inspected. Even though the truck is empty, it has to be inspected. And this is the inspection process. Moving from left to right in this graphic, you can see that the first inspection or potential inspection is by Mexican Customs. Aduanas checks, but it's randomly. It's not a 100% check. It's random. Probably 1 in 10 trucks are inspected just to make sure that the paperwork is correct. Then that particular truck moves into the U.S. to the federal compound, which is managed by Customs and Border Protection. And there is a potential of going into secondary inspection, which could be X-ray or gamma ray or other type of inspections. But also there's other federal agencies that work inside the federal compound, and includes FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, part of the Department of Transportation. There's agricultural inspections as well. So there's a bunch of other federal agencies that work inside the federal compound. And then on top of that, when the truck leaves that federal compound, then it goes to a state safety inspection facility. So the states have to be checking every single truck that goes into the U.S. or into Texas, California, Arizona, or New Mexico for safety, even though FMCSA already did that. But anyway, that's a third inspection. So this is interesting because I got a call like 4 weeks ago from a reporter because a politician said that all trucks from Mexico were coming without being inspected. I said, wow, this is amazing. I mean, there's 3 inspections at least, 2 on the U.S. side, 1 in Mexico. And then on top of that, again, there's also all the filing that needs to be done in order to move into the U.S. So what that creates, again, is it's congestion, and has several impacts, not only at the trade community in terms of cost, but also environmental issues. Obviously, most of the urban areas at the border are very polluted. They're non-attainment because of that congestion of trucks burning diesel at the border. So this is just a picture of one of the crossings in Texas. So So those are the key impacts that are impacting, again, at the border level, but also at the national level, because as we heard earlier this morning, these costs are also brought into the final consumer. It's interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with the Alameda Corridor in Los Angeles. This is a project like 20 years ago now that was developed in order to move cargo out of the ports of LA Long Beach into inland. And the way this project was justified was, what was the cost of people here in Washington, for example, or in New York or Chicago, of handling better handling that product coming in from LA Long Beach? What's going to be the impact? So it was a national case that was brought into why there has to be some funding for that project. And as we heard this morning, again, the story of the border hasn't been broadcasted to everyone because, again, these impacts that you see at the border are negatively impacting our economies. So potential alternatives that we have analyzed at TTI for years, and I divide them into hardware and software. Basically infrastructure development and changes in processes. Obviously, the infrastructure development is costlier, takes longer time because there's a bunch of different agencies involved in the process, but also there's some other ones which could be relatively easier. So, for example, the first one is to add additional border crossing infrastructure or improve the existing one. That's another one. I guess I mentioned we have 25 crossings that handle trucks, but only 6 of them handle the vast majority of that. So what can we do to do that? So for example, as Jose was mentioning earlier, there's this FAST program, the Free and Secure Trade Program, which requires a special lane for those shipments to move into the US. But sometimes the infrastructure is not well positioned in order to handle a specific lane. So if you can work with Mexico and expand that fast lane further south, so there's actually a complete lane all the way from Mexico into the US, that will be more efficient. So that would improve also the use of the FAST program and the CTPAT. Again, that's something that we have encouraged. And some port of entries have that additional land that is very valuable to be able to do that. But again, that's something that could be even done much faster. Also improving the corridors leading to the ports of entry. In some states, like, again, we're going to hear from California, what they're doing is an additional toll road that leads to Otay Mesa. So that's interesting. But again, that has to be done also on the Mexican side. And that's something that it was touched a little bit in the morning, but one of the reasons why things at the border don't move as fast as we will hope is because there's multiple stakeholders, most of them with different objectives. There's the security aspects, the trade aspects, the health aspects. So there's a bunch of different agencies at work, and then you have 2 countries, and then you have federal, state, and local levels, so that complicates everything. And that's why it's important, even though we have been working more than 25 years, we're moving very slowly into improving the process. It takes a lot of coordination. So moving into the software options, again, modify the process that I just mentioned. Again, this is important. I mean, I think some of those inspections could be commingled, could be done jointly, as we mentioned earlier, I was heard earlier. And also streaming the process that already Matt touched on that, because that's something that takes a long time to get permits, to get everything moving. As I mentioned earlier, this is just a brief list of the federal, state, local, and private stakeholders. And now it's going to put another column on the other side, the Department of State, and there's SRE on the other side, DHS, and there's also Aduanas and DOT, and there's SCT. So again, there's all these different agencies that have to be coordinated in order to develop ports of entry or international border crossings. Now, on the funding mechanisms, again, as Matt mentioned, the construction itself, the creation of this binational bank will be a great binational infrastructure bank. That's something, again, that we have proposed in our research in order to come up to have additional funding. And also the operation. And on the operation, there's something going on because, I mean, what CBP usually comes back to us and say, okay, we can build this new infrastructure, but then we need manpower to operate that. And that's also expensive because you need to have, again, agents in both US and Mexico to staff that particular port of entry. So you can have 10 lanes, but if you don't have enough staff to open all of them, there's going to be creating congestion. So again, the staffing, and CBP has these donation programs, pilots right now. Hopefully those pilots will come permanent, and you can have basically it's private sector or public sector can donate to CBP in order to have additional staff on that particular POE or port of entry. Adding or improving infrastructure, again, to prove the process, and Matt already touched on that, the presidential permit process, but also the whole process takes years in order to come up with that. And there's just a list of potential items that are needed in order to make sure that the port of entry could be built. Again, improve the trusted traveler programs, the FAST, Free and Secure Trade Program. I mean, there could be some improvements, again, as I mentioned, with infrastructure, but again, also with the processes. As you saw from the diagram that showed the trucks coming into the border, then the drayage, and then the other part, that breaks the supply chain security. So that's one item that needs to be handled. I mean, it's not the same of, again, crossing from Canada, where, again, in Canada, most of the industry and people live close to the border. But in this case, if you're coming all the way, say, from Oaxaca to the border, I mean, it's very difficult to have a secure supply chain. So there has to be some ways to secure that in order to come all the way to Laredo, for example. Joint inspections, we already touched on that. I mean, Jose told us about the progress they have been doing in Laredo at the airport, and then in Otay Mesa for the produce. I think Arizona is also doing something in the near future. So that's been great. I mean, the savings have been tremendous in terms of not only time, but also the cost for the shippers and the receivers. And finally, the elimination of the duplicate safety inspections. I mean, it's, again, doing almost the same inspection for the vehicle safety. So what do you need to have both of them? And again, there's that time and takes time and money to do that. And then the single filing, I didn't know that you were doing that, progress, so that's great. Basically, again, that's something that we have been proposing for years. You don't need to file the same information to different systems, 2 different times. So hopefully for trucks, will come up, in 2018. And as I mentioned, the donation acceptance program, hopefully, again, is not a pilot, but it goes all the way to implementation on a regular basis, and the binational funding source that Matt already went through. So that's all I have. I'll wait for questions at the end. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Let's see, is this, oh, there we go, look at that. Great to be here. I think this has been a fantastic program, and I think talking a little bit about one specific new border crossing maybe, in a sense, gives some practical examples that pick up on a lot of what's been discussed so far. Minat Jones, as Kim mentioned, is pleased to be supporting SANDAG with advocacy support here in Washington as well as in Mexico City for this specific project, Otay Mesa East. So let me start just actually one step before Otay Mesa East. SANDAG is the San Diego Association of Governments, which actually was first created in 1966 when the governments in San Diego County came together and created a comprehensive planning organization to do some long-range planning. In 1980, they changed the name to SANDAG. It's comprised of the 18 cities plus the government of San Diego County all together to do this regional decision-making. And it's governed by a board of directors that includes mayors and council members and county officials as well. So, Otay Mesa East, let me give you some of the background, sort of the why do we need another crossing, and Juan and Matt actually alluded to a lot of it. This project is unique for several reasons, both in terms of leadership, technology, and financing, and so I'll cover all of those. But just to start a little bit of background, of the 50 legal border crossings between the United States and Mexico, 9 of them are in California. San Ysidro is the largest border crossing between San Diego and Tijuana. The existing Otay Mesa crossing, which Juan mentioned, is the largest commercial POE linking California and Mexico. And at peak operation, 4 trucks cross every minute. In 2015, about $42.5 billion worth of merchandise crossed the border. So obviously a very busy and active port of entry. San Ysidro recently had some improvements which initially reduced wait times to cross the border, although after the initial reductions, the wait times have come back up. And San Ysidro is a passenger pedestrian crossing. It's not a commercial crossing. So even that expansion, when it's fully completed in 2019, doesn't answer the need for more infrastructure on the commercial side. So there's sort of an aerial picture of what the area looks like. And it was the need for a third crossing between Tijuana and San Diego and the scarcity of federal funds, and this is an important point, that drove plans for the future port of entry. Back as far as 2006, an analysis was undertaken that showed that the border wait times were costing the region money. They were missing out on a lot of economic activity, millions of dollars, in fact. And that study is now being updated. You can find more information on SANDAG's webpage, which is sandag.org. So starting in 2006, there's run through really quickly a timeline where you can see where things started with initial legislation to allow for tolling a tax authority, some initial agreements between the United States and Mexico, and then I think things really become solidified in 2014 when Mexico's Undersecretary for Infrastructure in the Secretariat of Communications and Transportation, Raul Murrieta, and California's Secretary of Transportation, Brian Kelly, signed an MOU to build and then bring the new port of entry into operation. So I'll go back to the aerial shot. The crossing will link the Otay Centenario borough in Tijuana with East Otay Mesa in San Diego County. And the POE itself is the lime green section. And the initial baseline concept is to have 10 northbound commercial lanes, 10 northbound passenger lanes, and 8 southbound lanes. But there's an innovation analysis currently underway that SANDAG has undertaken that will look at some of the details and make final recommendations on exactly what should be built. But basically, as you can sense, I mean, 10, 10, and 8, this is a really large crossing. And one of the goals, I think, picking up on something Juan had said, is rather than having to reconfigure, which is what's happening at San Isidro, they're going to try to build it thinking ahead and planning for continued expansion. The border wait times in the San Diego area, particularly at peak, range from 2 to 4 hours. And the goal of Otay Mesa East, or OME, is to reduce that to a 20-minute wait time. And that's 20 minutes from a defined point on either side of the border to the crossing. It doesn't include whatever time it might take customs or aduana to review the contents, because obviously that's not something that SANDAG would be able to control. So as I said, there are 3 sort of main, and you can group the innovations and the unique points in 3 ways. So in terms of leadership, the OME project is a collaboration between a local regional government on our side and the federal government on the Mexican side, which in and of itself is unique, and you can imagine there are some challenges that come from those different levels. And the structure really just reflects the difference in the way that we build and maintain infrastructure and roads in the U.S. versus the way it's done in Mexico. So I think you can see there several U.S. Federal agencies are involved, even though it's led by a regional government. That doesn't mean the federal government isn't involved. You have transportation, state, GSA, Customs and Border Protection. At the state level on the U.S. side, you have Caltrans, the Department of Transportation, California, and SANDAG, of course. On the Mexican side, you have Communications and Transport, SCT, you have the Foreign Ministry, you have SAT, Customs and Internal Revenue Service, and you have the National Migration Institute in Mexico. And then you have both the state of Baja and the city of Tijuana. So obviously lots of government entities which cooperate well together, but as you can imagine, it's complicated when you have that many people needing to sit at the table. The technology, I think, is to me really the most exciting point. OME will bring some new technological features to the border that ideally would be applicable in other future crossings between the U.S. and Mexico or elsewhere. The road system will be a controlled access toll road. with a variable tolling scheme. So that's a little bit new. And that obviously is how you control the wait times. You create a system where drivers can make a cost-benefit analysis of, do I want to wait 2 to 4 hours, or do I want to pay whatever the toll might be? So how do you do that, right? How do you know that it's a 20-minute wait time, or how do you vary the tolls? So SANDAG will establish a regional intelligent transportation system that will include sensors to track transportation data that relates to the entire border area. Because again, in order to know what to toll or what the incentive is to do Otay Mesa East, you have to know what's happening at other crossings as well. So this will now enable SANDAG to monitor the whole border and create real-time data, which drivers would then use to make the decision on what to cross. It also will allow SANDAG to help figure out the available lanes in each direction, how to configure them, how to determine the appropriate toll rates to maintain that 20-minute goal, and to advise users of wait times. The POE itself will also have some innovations, including the possibility of reversible or flexible lanes, and potentially, as Jose Martin mentioned this morning, a combined customs review facility where the two governments would review cargo together on the U.S. side, but review for both. The reversible, flexible lanes give much greater flexibility to adjust traffic flows, again, to ensure that 20-minute wait time. You could change the number of lanes receiving passengers versus commercial. Or as I said, initially you're starting with a goal of 10 and 10, but you could moderate that. And you could also even change the number of lanes going northbound or southbound to take into account traffic demands. And those are all things, I think nothing I described is unheard of conceptually. I mean, even in the DC area, we have streets that have reversible lanes, and we have variable tolling on the Beltway, for example. But this would be the first time all these things have ever been incorporated into a border crossing. And as I mentioned, SANDAG is currently doing an innovation study to look at different options, figuring out the possibilities and obviously the costs of different types of configurations. So when I showed you the aerial view with the lime green box of the POE and you can't see anything, well, that is the way you design the slide, but it's also in fact true that we're not sure exactly what the green box looks like yet. So the last part, and not insignificant, of course, is the financing. And OME is being developed through a combination of federal and state grants, SANDAG's local tax authority, which allows it to toll, and private capital. There will be an offering in the private bond market once the project is a little further along. The toll revenue will be split between SANDAG and Mexico based on a formula that still needs to be negotiated, and it will depend in part on the costs of the construction and the payment mechanisms. So the slide there is not to scale, or at least not decided that that's exactly what the breakdown would look like. The assumption is that the costs are higher on the U.S. side. The tolls, by the way, will all be collected on the U.S. side, so it'll be one sort of toll area on the controlled access road, whether you're going north or south. But the revenues, as I said, will be shared according to a formula. Mexico has identified funds to obtain the land that it needs for access roads on its side. On the U.S. side, SANDAG has secured most of the right-of-way for the roads. In fact, some of the roads have already been built, and the SR-11, which is the access road, is operating to a point, not quite all the way to the border yet. And SANDAG is working on getting the right-of-way for the actual port of entry. So these next couple slides just sort of show graphically how everything comes together, what steps need to be done. As I mentioned, you have the intelligent transportation system. You have the agreements on how the toll revenues will be split up. Eventually, you get to talking to customs and aduana about operating and maintaining and staffing. And when you put the whole puzzle together, then you have a piece that you can go to the private market and raise funds, raise capital. And once you have everything in place, then you can start construction. So OME, in our view, and in Sandag's view, most importantly, represents an innovative way to build, fund, and operate border crossings to facilitate trade between our two countries. And it brings together safety, security, and efficiency considerations in a bilateral format, which requires intense collaboration. And we hope, as I mentioned earlier, that the lessons learned from this POE will be applicable elsewhere on the border and really represent the best in public-public collaboration and cross-border partnership. So thank you.
I'm going to stay in my seat if you don't mind. I was sitting here thinking that the question that I have to ask you, and I think it already exists, but is there an app for that? So will it be an app that you can put on your phone and find out how long it's going to take to get across?
That's a good question. I am sure there will be. I don't think I've gotten to that point yet. But since there are apps for that sort of thing in other areas, I'm sure there will be.
Yes, there is also funded by Federal Highway and TxDOT. We develop a border wait time measuring system for most of the crossings in Texas, and it's on the website, and we are developing an app already for that. And in Tijuana, there's another app, I think was developed by a local university, but it requires additional data in order to be more efficient. CBP has its own app. But even CBP acknowledges that it's not very accurate.
Since I abused the chair in the first panel, I thought I would open for questions from the audience. This one, if there are any. The microphone will come to you. Please identify yourself, and please ask your question in the form of a question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for doing the panel. My name is Brian Dabbs. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg BNA. Mr. Rooney, I was wondering if you think that a NAFTA renegotiation has been discussed thoroughly, for the past 18 months or so on the campaign trail, and since, despite the fact that we haven't seen a lot of kind of concrete proposals materialize, is kind of a proper or reasonable venue or forum to advance the infrastructure bank and kind of comprehensive plan, which you referenced, aimed at that kind of holistic integration, and you had said that we are, deficient in terms of on that respect when compared to other trade blocs. And then secondly, I'm wondering if you think NAFTA renegotiation is a proper, reasonable venue to advance, more oil and gas investment, liberalization of course, kind of in the wake of these constitutional changes and kind of watershed Mexican energy reform.
Thanks for the question. So addressing them perhaps in reverse order, I think that energy is often referred to as the missing chapter of NAFTA. When NAFTA was negotiated in 1992-93, Mexico's energy sector was significantly different than it is today, and so the Mexicans were not able or not willing to negotiate energy at that time. So the reforms that have taken place in Mexico more recently certainly create an opportunity for an integrated North American energy market that didn't exist before. I myself have always felt that while the oil-related aspects of the Mexican energy reform are the most kind of interesting, perhaps, or the most kind of spectacular because of the history of that set of issues, in terms of the amount of money to be made and the potential economic benefit, the liberalization of Mexico's electricity markets and market for generation and distribution of electrical power are perhaps more significant. And here you have enormous opportunities for cross-border integration, where the policy environment is perhaps less important than some of the technical challenges that are at stake. But there's an enormous opportunity there. You look at across the North American space, even within the three North American countries, there are price kind of frontiers, areas where the market is obviously walled off for one reason or another, usually for technical reasons, not so much for policy reasons. But there are enormous opportunities there to equalize prices across the North American space. Mexico is a low-cost energy producer. and therefore there are opportunities for greater efficiency and reducing cost across the North American space. I think my own view would be that that is the proper approach to take in any approach to the North American arrangement, is to ask ourselves, how can we become more competitive globally as a regional production space? How can we remove cost from the production chains in order to make ourselves more productive, increase the productivity of our workforce, and increase our competitiveness across the globe? And there are opportunities, not just in the energy space. I think the North American Development Bank, which despite its name is a U.S.-Mexico institution, not a trilateral institution, was created after the formal negotiation of NAFTA in 1993 in order to address concerns about divergent environmental conditions, particularly between the United States and Mexico. So that is an institution that exists as a supportive institution of the NAFTA arrangement, but it isn't per se a NAFTA. It wasn't called for by the NAFTA treaty arrangement. So I would envision the opportunity there for the idea of a border infrastructure bank, which I would hope would be trilateral, not just bilateral. That would include Canada, Mexico, and the United States. A formula, obviously, to be negotiated in terms of who puts in how much capital. The board would have to be structured appropriately. I mean, the same kind of process would have to be gone through as was gone through to create the North American Development Bank. But the opportunity is there, again, as a supportive institution to any rearrangement of the NAFTA arrangements. That kind of, we've seen these different presentations. I mean, embedded in Andrew's presentation was a huge amount of uncertainty about coordinating the process across the border and dealing with the revenue flows. And that is a perfect role for an institution like this that could provide that fiduciary transparency for the revenues, and be a fiduciary agent that would be kind of jointly controlled by both countries. And then Juan Carlos's presentation, likewise, I think you saw a lot of opportunities there where there's kind of a missing piece, and that missing piece, to my mind, is that structure that doesn't have to be a treaty commitment, but certainly supports implementation of the treaty. And as I say, any review, to my way of thinking, any review of the NAFTA arrangement that is directed at enhancing the global competitiveness of the region makes total sense. Did that successfully evade your question? I do. I mean, again, assuming that we're talking about a review of the NAFTA arrangement that's designed to enhance the global competitiveness of the region, I think all the tools that we've discussed here today have to be deployed in one sense or the other. Again, whether they form a part of a revised treaty arrangement or not is something that the negotiators would have to work out. But assuming that that's the objective, I think we've seen here this morning actually a pretty good agenda for how you would do that.
We probably have time for one more, if there's one more question. Otherwise, anyone? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank our group, and I hope we've left you with a sense today that diving deeply into the border, this is a hugely complex living thing that is between the United States and Mexico, and I really do think that the concept of a valve is the concept we need to have in mind as we try to figure out how to move this agenda forward.
Sorry, you're entitled to the last word, so I don't want to deprive you of that. You said valve. I've often thought in terms of a filter, and you have to design a filter very carefully to block the things that you don't want to have pass and to let through the things that you do have pass. And I used to use that metaphor from time to time in talking to groups, and the only time where it got really kind of like appreciative nods and a little bit of a chuckle was I was talking to a bilateral meeting of wastewater management officials, and I said filter, and they went, yeah, I get that.
So I'm sticking with valve. But thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and thanks for coming in.